Good morning to everybody. So now it's 11:47. So we had a shorter break, and sorry for that. So now we will continue with the second session. Obviously, everything is linked, but this one will be more focused on amendment, suspension and termination. So I am Nadia Lamandaz. I'm working in CINEA, in the unit in charge of environment and nature on the LIFE program. Next slide, please. So this session is actually called amendment, this first session, but should be best name as how to deal with deviation. You heard our colleagues from the finance talking a lot about deviation. And so what happened if we deviate from that? What happened if we deviate from that? So obviously deviation are very common. And we know that there are a lot of deviations, and some deviation may lead to amendment, other would not lead to amendment, will lead only to information to CINEA and reporting. So that's really important to know, is that not all deviation, and actually a limited number of them, lead to amendment. So in the grant agreement that you have signed, there are some specific articles which refer to amendment. For example, the Article 39, which is called amendment, and it's really state the conditions and the procedure for the amendment. So this article is important, and you can have a look to that more in detail to get exactly the conditions and the procedures. The Article 5.5 is also an important article because it's related to what we call the budget flexibility. We heard a lot Licinha explaining, and also Anne explaining, for example, that budget shift between beneficiary, between cost category, all that is perfectly allowed without amendment. Obviously, there is always the little caveat if it does not imply significant changes in the description of the action in Annex 1. Actually, what do we mean here is that, as Anne mentioned in one of the reply, actually you have to look to, is this deviation is significant in terms of the project implementation, its objective, its main outcome, what do you plan to do, the ambition also of the project, all that are for us some significant changes. Some of those significant changes, by the way, are not even allowed. So they are actually what we call questioning the award of the action, and this is not allowed even with an amendment. So this is a bit like the red line. So we cannot accept changes that would question the fact that we awarded your project. So this is, but those changes are obviously major changes. So for example, you do something completely different, or with you reduce a lot the ambition that make your project better than others. So this is a bit the logic. Below that, you can do a lot of deviation, especially if the context imply them or make them necessary. This is also something which is important when you implement your project, and we will come back to that later. On the budget flexibility, although you have a lot of flexibility, there are some issues that you cannot change without an amendment. And here Licinha mentioned it already, the volunteer. So if you don't have volunteer and you want to have volunteer, you have to have an amendment. Category with lump sums as well. And the category with budget ceilings, for example, the financial support to third party. Just remember that in some call, those categories are not allowed. In some they are, in some they are not. So the amendment is not always possible either if they were not allowed in the call. Okay. There is a specific element that I will explain better later. It's the addition of amount for subcontracted, for subcontract. As you know, this was reminded, subcontract is a bit of a special category where you actually subcontract part of the action to an external entity, okay? And there, again, it's possible to have additional amount subcontracted, and some of that might require an amendment, other might not, and we will have a different type of approval procedure, which is called simplified approval procedure, and I will explain that later. Next slide. So some principles which are important. So we know that, of course, your timing and our timing might be a bit different. So, and sometimes you have to take action quite quickly and you have to implement your project and to adjust your implementation. However, be careful because the retroactivity is not accepted automatically. So for example, if you start doing the changes and those changes might require an amendment and you haven't asked it and we are not aware before, therefore, we might either refuse completely the amendment or accept the amendment, but only from the time where we know about the changes. So why we say that? It's really important that you communicate as soon as you know that a deviation might require an amendment. So basically you inform us, and that's the date where we know about it, okay? One important other thing is the deadline to submit an amendment. So there is nothing in the grant agreement telling that you can't submit an amendment until the end of your project. However, please note that some of the amendment cannot be implemented after the end date of the project. So bluntly, the system will not allow it. Please note as well is that there is a timing for us to instruct the amendment, for you to submit and for us to instruct it. So the general good practice is that you submit the amendment at least 3 months before the end date. Okay, so like this, there is no issues and we are not blocked by the system. So of course, if you don't know, that's a main principle, as it was already mentioned several times, ask either your monitor via the monitoring help desk or your project advisor if you don't have a monitor assigned to you, like for the clean energy transition project. Next slide. So there is a little delay. I don't see the slide. Voilà. So there are some deviation, as I was mentioning, that we don't even need, they don't need approval. So all those, I mean, they are really minor deviation. So for example, you have to change something in the budget, a small amount, okay? Some activity that was not foreseen, but you know they are important considering the little change in the context that you had. Or because when you start your implementation, you realize that you have to do something, for example, something before another things. So basically your timeline is different. So all that does not require, and of course, if they don't imply substantive changes, as I said, that's always something that you have to keep in mind when you analyze your system, your change. I mean, this does not require any prior approval. You just go ahead, you implement your project because at the end, you know that you will have the same expected result and the same objective and the same ambition. The same with the deliverable. We know that deliverable, you can have some adjustment. For example, the title of the deliverable is not exactly that title, it could be a different one. All these, if you don't change the objective of the work package to which the deliverable is linked to, doesn't require any prior approval. You just go ahead and you implement, and you will just put a little message in when you submit your deliverable or when you report under the specific work package. As I said, some delays in the work, in the deliverable, does not require doesn't require an amendment. Just remember, and we mentioned that already in the other session, that for example, if you need to change a deliverable delivery due date, you can ask the project advisor to do it. It does not require an amendment. If it's important for you because, for example, a deliverable was foreseen in the first period of your project and it's actually foreseen now in the second, you can ask the project advisor. Alors, again, the change in the context that can have some impact on the milestone or the deliverable. As I said, all this does not require, first, doesn't require an amendment and does not even require systematic approval. I mean, prior approval of SINEA. Of course, what you do, you report on them, for example, in the work package, and that's it. Of course, if you're not sure, please ask either your monitor via the monitoring help desk or your project advisor. Next slide. So there are some changes that require what we call simplified approval. And I will explain, I will have a slide on simplified approval procedures, so a bit later. So for example, when you have a new subcontract, so you foresee to have a task done by the consortium staff, okay? Personnel, whatever category of personnel of staff, okay? And actually you realize that that will not work and you need to subcontract that part of the action, okay? This, you have to see if the budget is either relatively 10% more or in absolute term 50,000 euro. Therefore, you have to pre-inform us. So basically, you send either via the monitoring help desk or directly to your project advisor. If you are a CET project, you inform us, okay? So basically what you do, you inform about this change, okay? And what you will do, you will report on that deviation later on. So here what is important is that there is a prior information that is requested and that is better to have, and I will explain why, okay? Alors, there is a little caveat here, is that, but I will maybe explain what I mean as long as the total of the subcontracting stays below the 30%, because I will explain that in a subsequent slide. Next slide. So here it is, the famous simplified approval procedures. What is this? This is when you have a deviation, that, as I was mentioning, the one on actually you decided to subcontract part of the action that was initially not subcontracted. This is require a simplified approval procedure. It means that the next periodic report under the section 4.3 budget, you will explain and you will notify us what you have done. So if you did not notify us before, we did not have this prior information, we will discover during the periodic report, we will discover the change. And therefore we will assess it and we may disagree with it, okay? And so this is why the prior information is important. Like this, there is no risk that we reject the cost because at the report, or at least we question the cost at the report, and therefore you have an issue with the eligibility of that specific cost. So this is why it's important to have a prior information. However, the prior information does not remove the necessity for you to signal the cost and this deviation in the section 4.3 of the budget as a deviation, because the specific deviation is required to have a simplified approval procedure at least, okay? Next slide. So the cases where we require an amendment. So that's some, of course, this is not the full list, it's only examples, but actually all the change of partnership, for example, of course, only beneficiary or affiliated entity can claim cost. So if you have an entity staff, for example, of an affiliated that was not foreseen in your grant agreement initially, but you have to do an amendment, because we have to have this affiliated entity recognized as an affiliated an entity that can claim costs. Okay, so that's really important, that any change in the partnership composition requires an amendment. There is also as a core of your grant agreement, the section called data sheet. Here we have a lot of different elements, like the periodic report, the duration, the EU contribution. All those elements are fixed in the grant agreement in this data sheet section. Any change to those would require an amendment. So this is really important. And if you haven't, I suppose you already have read the grant agreement, but if you go there and you see all the elements that you have in this section, if you touch that element, it requires an amendment. For example, the reporting period that Anne mentioned and Lichinia. So for example, if you know that you won't be able to spend the 70% by the time of the first reporting period, and you don't want to request less of the second pre-financing, you will have to ask for launch an amendment to have a reporting period which will be a bit delayed. Okay. Duration of the project as well. This is clear. Any cost, any activity outside the duration of the project is not eligible. So all this makes sense. It's very common sense. Other things which we touch upon a bit before is essential aspect of the project. It can be that you do not question the call of the action, or you do not question, for example, the ambition, but still you need to change an important aspect of your project. For example, the technology, or if you have some habitat species targeted and actually you want to have different targeted habitat and species, you have to ask why, because it might be that in our assessment, this actually call into question the initial award of the grant. So, and it's better to have an amendment because we mutually agree on a new type, a new action, or a new, for example, way to reach your objective. So this is things that usually would require an amendment because like this, you and us, we have a common agreement of main setting of your project. So for example, also new strand of work that was not foreseen and that becomes necessary, and that might represent a significant part of the project and therefore budget. So here it's also important that an amendment could have a clear and common understanding of what is expected and the budget which goes with these expectations. Okay, so the budget shift between beneficiary and project and budget category is only necessary if indeed it's linked to significant changes in the action, not just because it's better that the partner A is doing the action than the partner B, while it's exactly the same result and exactly the same expectation at the work package, for example. This does not require an amendment. I'm hammering a bit that because it's really important. And voilà. The last point is the one that I was mentioning before, is as you, most of you have in their grant agreement, a clause which limit the subcontracting to roughly to 30%, okay? So this clause is a specific clause for most of your projects. So if you know that you will, if you decide, for example, to subcontract more action than what is expected before, and you know that when you do that, you will go above the 30% of the limited subcontracting, this would require an amendment. Obviously, for most of our project, because this limit is relatively high, we never have this risk. But it's really up to you to do this estimation and to know if you are reaching the limit of the 30%, and while you have the clause of the limited subcontracting and TIC, and this is the article 6.2 B. So please have a look to the data sheet and try to see if you are in that context before safely implementing only the simplified approval procedure, while in your case, an amendment would be required because you would go above the 30%. If you have a doubt, ask your monitor or your project advisor. So when you have an amendment, there is the amendment procedure to be done. So here I refer to you to the meeting to the presentation that we did on the 4th of October. And obviously on the huge guidance that we have on the portal that explain how to launch a procedure, in which conditions and how. Next slide. So there is an article which is also interesting, is the Article 19. So the Article 19, read it if you haven't done it, is the obligation to inform. So what that means, so basically what we require, what we agreed in this grant agreement is that you have to provide us information when we ask it. So for example, of course, there is the reporting, but there might be also other type of information that we can ask you if we have a doubt, for example, or additional information that we may require to you, and you have to provide them to us because this is how we do our checks, okay? You must also keep us informed if you have any change on your organization step, okay, level. I mean, if, for example, there is your organization change ownership, for example, it can happen. Or if you have a change of legal address, all this has to be up to date. And this is via the participant register portal. So the participant register portal must be updated all the time. And the two other points, the beneficiary must inform the granting authority, so SINEA, and the other beneficiary of the consortium, if there are some events or circumstances that makes the implementation of the grant difficult or impossible. Or of course, here it's not all the small issues, but are major issue that will question your ability to implement the grant. Next slide. So that's the point that I was referring about the participant portal. So when you have a change of the legal data, what is required is that you go in the participant register portal, you notify the changes, and the REA Central Validation Service will look at the changes, might request additional documents, supporting document, and will deal with a type of amendment which is named information procedure. So basically, this is not an amendment that you request to SINEA. It's information about changes that are somehow linked to your organization data, and that we take note and we update the participant register portal. Some of those changes might lead to further action and especially further amendment. For example, if you change if, for example, what we call universal takeover change will imply a change of bank account, that would require an amendment. If not, everything is done in the participant register portal and will appear in the grant management service tool as amended without further process. Okay, next slide. Voilà. So here we have finished the suspension. We are finished the amendment, and we will start to talk about termination and suspension. So here again, we have specific article in the grant agreement that I invite you to read carefully. And this presentation now will mostly present those articles and the content of those articles with a bit of explanation and let's say point what you have to be careful on. So just for you to know, both a suspension and a termination can be requested either by the beneficiary or by SINEA. What we mentioned by suspension is when you suspend the implementation of your project. I will come to that later. And a termination is when you either stop the participation of a specific beneficiary or when you stop before the initial end date, the termination, the implementation of a project. Okay. Here, when you have the possibility or you have a doubt about the fact that it might happen, such event might happen, of course, before, please inform your project, your project external monitor via the monitoring help desk or the project advisor. You have to inform us as soon as you have a doubt, and we can also help you to assess the situation and to decide what is the best course of action considering your case. Next slide. Next slide. So the grant agreement suspension requested by the consortium, that's the most common situation. So basically what's happening is that, for example, you have there is something happening, for example, a force majeure, a fire in your company, or some very catastrophic weather conditions in the site where you implement your project. This would make almost impossible to implement your project as foreseen in the continuation. Therefore, you can request to suspend the implementation of your project while you deal with the consequences of that specific situation. Okay? How you do that? The coordinator requests the suspension using an amendment. So basically, you use the amendment. You use the amendment consortium requested by the consortium, and what you do, you suspend the implementation. It's one of the clauses that you will select, and you have to explain why. You explain the date where you will suspend, and the date when you think you will be able to resume the activity. Next slide. So just to be clear, when you suspend, you really suspend. There is no possibility to claim any cost during the suspension dates period. So basically, the project is really frozen. And when you know that you can resume the activity, so the conditions are back to normal, what you do, you have to launch a new amendment. Okay, so obviously the first amendment, it will be, if the justification is correct, it will be accepted, and that will suspend the activity. And then you have to have a second amendment to restart the activity and to make the cost again eligible. Okay, so that's the logic. It's relatively logic, and the grant agreement explains well the procedures, and the IT system also is set to have that automatically done via an amendment procedure. Next slide. Alors, there is also the possibility that SINEA initiate the suspension. So here it's really initiated. So basically what we do, this is rare, really rare, is when we have some suspicion or evidence of fraud, substantial error, really breach of obligation of the grant agreement, that we may inform you of our intention to suspend the grant agreement while, for example, we do some investigation. Okay, so here there is a full procedure where first we pre-inform you. You have a time to reply, giving your observation. So either we continue with the suspension procedure or we discontinue the procedure, okay? But anyway, that's the way it's done. And of course, if we do suspend, following our initiation, we confirm the suspension, you will have to relaunch, or will lift the suspension after the time, if it's the conclusion of our investigation, for instance. And we will ask you to request an amendment. Why? Because we know that after a suspension, you need to take some, to think again about the project and potentially to have some changes, for example, the duration, because you will have to add the time of the suspension, for instance. But there could be also other consequences of the suspension that would have to be included in the new amendment after the suspension. Here again, even if SINEA initiating the suspension, no costs are allowed during the suspension time. Next slide. Okay, so now we go to the beneficiary's termination. So why a beneficiary would terminate his participation? Well, sometimes it's because they want to. Okay, there is, for example, a change of business model, or some strong issues within the partnership, and sometimes it's because they're bankrupt, so it's beyond their wish. So all those reasons may have there is a necessity for a beneficiary to either request himself the termination, or for the consortium, the coordinating beneficiary on behalf of the consortium, requesting the termination of a beneficiary. So it can be also is that the terminator, the coordinator, sorry, is terminated. So in that case, it will be the rest of the beneficiary introducing the request of termination of the coordinator beneficiary, if this coordinator beneficiary is not in condition to ask himself his termination. Its termination, sorry. So it's done via also, it has to be requested as soon as possible. When you know that a beneficiary stopped working on a project, it's important to initiate the termination as quickly as possible, okay? One thing which is also important, and I will come that a bit later, is that this termination can question actually the whole grant agreement. For example, you have a beneficiary who has a major role in the grant agreement, and this beneficiary is bankrupt. So this might lead to a termination of the grant agreement. So because you don't have any alternative to that beneficiary role in that specific grant agreement. But of course, this can happen, but this can also be completely different. Next slide. So it's done by via amendment again. So amendment is really a workflow in the grant management system. The launching of an amendment, as you say, is also used to request a beneficiary termination. Okay, and in most of the case, you can have either one amendment or two amendments. Why? Because you can have only one amendment where you will mention the termination and also introduce all the modification that is the consequences of the termination of that specific beneficiary. Or if you can't do that in one amendment, you might have to do it in two amendments. So first, you initiate the termination. So you have a first amendment limited to the termination. However, please note that we expect to have a second one because we need to understand how the project will be able to continue without that specific beneficiary. Okay. So it's really important that you keep that in mind. Of course, efficiency would say better to have one amendment, but we do realize that sometimes it's not possible. Okay, next slide. So when, just one thing which is important is when the beneficiary is terminated, so when you request the termination of the beneficiary and when you submit your amendment requesting the beneficiary termination and possibly other changes, this I was clear during the presentation on the 4th of October, the termination is effective. So you can't revert back. The beneficiary is terminated. Even if we, for example, disagree with your alternative setting of the consortium, still, this beneficiary will be terminated. So we may reject, for example, the amendment, because we consider that your alternative is not good enough because question, for example, the implementation of the question too much the project. However, the beneficiary will be terminated. Okay, there is no way back. The only way back is to ask it again in the consortium. What is also important is that we need to have the opinion of the beneficiary concerned. So, or at least the proof that you requested the opinion and they did not reply. If the termination concern the coordinator and it's done without its agreement, then as we said before, as I said before, it can be done on behalf of the other beneficiaries, acting on behalf of the consortium. And I can say here, there is some legal implication, and therefore we need to have all the justification there. One thing which is also important is there is always two dates when you terminate a beneficiary or a grant agreement. There is the date of the end of the work. So after that date, for example, this beneficiary stopped work or will not claim any cost. Okay, if he claim any, but actually he cannot claim any cost after that date. And there is the actual termination date when is the date when the amendment is submitted, actually. And that's the last point about improper termination is exactly what I said before, is that imagine that you terminate and we do not agree about how you deal with the consequences of that termination. This is improper termination, and there are some impact there that either we terminate the grant because we consider that the situation is no more it's conducive to a proper implementation, or there is also the reduction of the grant, which is a specific Article 31. Next slide. Alors, what next? So this is also important. This is well explained in the grant agreement. And here I just put words there. So what is important is that when a beneficiary is terminated, he has to report on the work that has been done. We don't wait until the end for the report of that specific beneficiary. It's important that it's reported. He has 60 days, this beneficiary, to submit a technical report and to submit financial statement and also a certificate on financial statement if necessary by the voilà, he has to do that, and we will assess that report and after the submission. What is also important is that the coordinator must prove that he has actually provided some of the pre-financing to that specific beneficiary. If not, we consider that this beneficiary did not receive any pre-financing. Okay. Voilà. So, and exactly what if it was not submitted before, we also expect a second request of amendment to explain how you deal with the consequences of the termination. Okay, next slide. Next slide. So now we are at the grant agreement termination. So this is requested by the consortium. This is not that rare, actually. Well, it's not common, but it's not that rare that the situation of the project implementation is so different that, for example, it makes it irrelevant to implement the action. Okay, or that, for example, if you had a suspension with some impact very strong on the project context, for example, that you never have again the let's say the context to implement the grant as foreseen. Therefore, you have to terminate. You have to request for termination. Again, it's requested via an amendment requested by the consortium. And it's important that you do, if you think you are in this situation, which is unfortunate, of course, and that you actually request the termination, because we should not be in a situation where you are just stopping working while the project is supposed to continue, and where at the end we will consider that the grant has been terminated improperly, which has some consequences. So if you are in a situation like that, of course, contact your project advisor or first your CNEA external monitor, your external monitor, to explain the situation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Voilà. So, so when you start, when you launch a grant agreement termination, I'm not sure. Can you go to the slide before, please? Okay. Yeah, one thing I haven't said, which is really important, is when you submit your grant agreement termination, as for the project, the beneficiary termination, when actually you submit the amendment, it's done. We can't go back. It cannot be undo. Okay, so you really have to think before submitting a grant agreement termination. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so here, so we are at the situation where the grant agreement it's terminated. So you have 60 days so to submit your report, your final report. It's important that you submit it as a whole and that you cover all the period until the termination. And you might have also a financial statement, certificate, as for a normal final report. Okay. If you don't submit any of that, we suppose that you do not have any implementation and that we will recover the first all pre-financing that we would have. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So here we were in the situation where before, where you consider that you have either to terminate a beneficiary or a project. It can happen that we have also some ground actually to request either the termination of a beneficiary or the termination of a grant agreement. It's rare that we are under this situation, but it can happen. It can happen, for example, if we really consider that a termination of a beneficiary and all the amendment that you have submitted after to try to mitigate with this termination of this major key beneficiary, none of those alternatives are actually convincing us that the project will be implemented as before. Therefore, we might have to consider that a grant agreement must be terminated. Here, it's like the suspension. It's not done unilaterally without giving you the opportunity to provide us some observation. But so we will send you a pre-information letter. We will explain the situation. We will give you a list of arguments, our intention, the reason. You will provide us, if you think it's important, the observation. And therefore, we will assess those and we will either ask more questions or take a decision. Okay. Just for you to know, for the coordinator to know, for example, if we have some ground targeted to a specific beneficiary, we will have the communication with that beneficiary, okay? This pre-information letter will be sent to that beneficiary only. And it's only at the end of the process that the coordinator will be informed. This is probably because the ground for those type of termination is linked to some specific irregularity or suspicion of fraud. Next slide. So the effect. So the effect is that as before, we will have to calculate the final grant amount and the final payment based on the information that we have. So you must submit the periodic report until the end of the end date, the end of work date. And as before, we expect you to do that because without that, we have nothing to judge. There is a specific case here in orange that we might also initiate grant agreement termination for your obligation because of the consequences of breach to your obligation to submit report. So this is a specific case. For example, you have to submit a report, a periodic report, and you are completely unresponsive. Okay, and so we ask you first time, we ask you second time, so we remind you of your obligation to report, and you do not report. Okay, so the escalation, I'm sorry, because this is what it is, will be to tell you that we are now entering into a grant agreement termination. And at the end of that procedure, so it takes time and you have time to react and things like that, and to submit the report. But if you never submit the report, after a time, after the end of the termination, we will not accept any report. Okay, so therefore the consequences is that we will consider, even if you finally submit something, we will not look at it. So when you are, usually it's super rare, it can happen, but it's super rare to have unresponsive consortium. But in that case, you have to be careful because at one stage it will be too late. Next slide. For the beneficiary termination, here it's a bit like if it's requested by the coordinator. It's important that this partner submits the report, the financial statement, all this, and we will assess it, and all the payment related, the potential payment or action related to payment will be taken at the following periodic report, not immediately. And as it is written here in yellow, it was also the case for the other case, the information on the termination report of that specific beneficiary will have to be included by the coordinator in the overall periodic report to be submitted with the next periodic, at the end of the next periodic period. Next slide. Voilà. So here it's I think my last slide. So it's only few points which are important also and specify in your grant agreement. So any termination does not affect the granting authorities or CNEA right to reduce the grant. So basically to consider that due to improper implementation, for example, part of the grant is not implemented and should be reduced, and the grant amount, or to impose administrative sanction. So please have a look to those specific articles. You cannot claim any damage due to termination by us, by CINEA. So that's clear. If we consider that the termination has to be done, you cannot claim damage. And even if a beneficiary participation is terminated, they are still bound to a number of obligations, which are listed here, especially the one on the audit, which is very all the checks and review. Voilà. Next slide. I think that was my last slide. Thanks a lot for your attention.